Hello, welcome to another COVID-19 law and policy briefing produced by the Public Health Law Watch, a George Consortium initiative housed at Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University, the Network for Public Health Law, Change Lab Solutions, and the APHA Law section. We're here to provide expert legal analysis during the COVID-19 pandemic, and hopefully to answer some of your questions. For more information on the COVID legal response, please check out our report, Assessing Legal Responses to COVID-19 at www.covid19policyplaybook.org. In the report, 50 national experts assess the US policy response and provide specific recommendations on how federal, state, and local leaders can better respond to COVID-19 as well as future pandemics. I'm Wendy Parmet. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Health, Policy, and Law at Northeastern University School of Law. Our guests today are Lindsay Wiley, the director of the Health Law and Policy Program and professor of law at Washington College of Law at American University, and Professor Lance Gable from Wayne State University Law School. Please use the hashtag COVID Law Briefing for any questions or comments in response to this briefing. So as COVID-19 cases are resurging around the country, more and more health experts and government officials are calling for a mask mandate. In the last few days, several Republican governors who have long resisted mask mandates, including the governors of Utah, Iowa, and North Dakota, have imposed some kind of mandate. In addition, the president-elect has also talked about a mandate during the campaign, and more recently, he has emphasized that he would require masks in federal facilities. My sense is that in calling for a mandate, health experts may be missing some of the legal problems that might face at least a federal mandate. But before we explore those, I'm wondering, Lindsay, if you can give us a brief overview of what's been happening at the state level in terms of mandates and the legal challenges they're facing.
So as you indicated, it's a very dynamic situation. And in the aftermath of the election, we've seen additional movement, although it's hard to know how much of that is politically motivated and how much of it is in response to this fall resurgence. And when I checked this morning, it looks like at least 36 states and DC and Puerto Rico have statewide mandates. But even looking at the statewide level, you're missing a lot of what's happening, because in those states that don't have statewide mandates, we now have local governments pursuing their own mandates. And I think the biggest news out of Iowa last night was not just that there's a statewide mandate there, but that the Iowa governor was the kind of last holdout in blocking local mandates within her state. And so we've now got a situation where, to my knowledge, every state in which there's not a statewide mandate, local governments are at least not barred by the state from adopting their own mandates. And I think that's a big step forward. I should issue one caveat to that, and this kind of gets us into the variation among these mandates at the state and local level, which is that I believe in Florida, there is a statewide order that bars the imposition of fines and penalties by local governments for violation of their mandates. So I think another important thing to keep tabs on is these mandates are far from uniform, and they've varied even from time to time within a single jurisdiction, as jurisdictions have sought to balance and rebalance competing considerations, particularly concerns about the logistics of enforcement. And so we see some mandates that are really requirements imposed on licensed businesses to make sure that they are requiring customers to wear masks. We see others that are enforceable directly against individuals for not wearing masks. We see a wide variation in the penalties that are available, and the exceptions tend to vary, although there's some common ones that most mandates have adopted. In terms of legal challenges, the basic story here is that individual rights challenges to mask mandates have been unsuccessful. That's not for lack of trying. There have been dozens of claims filed seeking to invalidate mask orders on individual rights grounds, including First Amendment rights to expression and freedom of religion, arguments that they're arbitrary and capricious or that the exceptions to them are. But these claims, these challenges have been unsuccessful. The bigger vulnerability is structural challenges, questions about whether any given official who has issued the mandate has authority to do so. In that regard, I'm watching Wisconsin closely. The Supreme Court in Wisconsin heard arguments yesterday in a case that could invalidate the mandate there. The really interesting thing there is that the makeup of the state Supreme Court has changed since the court last invalidated the governor's orders. And so everyone's watching sort of a swing vote there to see whether the result will be different this time around. In the oral argument, there's some suggestion, though, that the mask mandate there could be vulnerable. But again, that's not on the grounds of individual rights. That's on the grounds that the governor lacks statutory authority because of a time limit applicable to the emergency powers he's used to issue the mandate.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Lance, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about a federal mandate. Once President-elect Biden is inaugurated, would he have the power to impose a nationwide mandate by executive order?
Well, the answer is yes in some areas, but not across the board, or at least I don't think so. So it would be, I think, pretty straightforward for President Biden to decide to implement a mandate in certain contexts. So for example, on all federal properties, using some of the transportation laws, requiring a mandate for masks in public transportation, probably across the board in the military, areas where the federal executive has a lot of control. But the idea of doing a kind of broad federal mask mandate that would cover everyone in the country, I think would run into some pretty significant legal challenges that exceeds the authority of the president to do just through executive order without some congressional authorization. Now, there might be some other options, though, in terms of trying to use federal power. So under Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, the CDC director could try to issue a broader nationwide mask mandate, similar to the mandate that was issued related to an eviction moratorium back in September. The only concern about this idea, though, is that the scope of Section 361 is something that hasn't really been tested. Currently, the eviction moratorium is being challenged, and there's I think a lot of concern among people who watch these issues closely that that could result in federal courts deciding that the CDC's authority there is not as broad as necessary to do some of these nationwide orders connected to public health. The underlying authority says that the CDC director can intervene and enact measures when state measures are insufficient to prevent the spread of communicable disease. And so you could make an argument that a national mask mandate would fit within that authority, but because it hasn't been tried prior to the eviction moratorium, I think there's kind of an uncertainty there as to whether courts would uphold an order of that breadth. And another concern related to that is that if courts don't do that, it could result in an interpretation of the CDC's authority that is extremely narrow and undermine future efforts that might be necessary to stop the spread of COVID and other future pandemics. And so, so those are some of the options on the table. I think, ultimately, when we think about what the future is, some of those national level challenges, we also have to consider the fact that the federal courts have now been really made full of, or packed full of, newly conservative justices or judges and justices at all levels. Our new ultra-conservative Supreme Court majority could use some of these challenges as an excuse, not only to rein in the CDC's powers, but also to resurrect the non-delegation doctrine and do some other things that would make it harder to pursue interventions for public health threats at the federal level going forward.
Thanks. That brings me, Lindsay, to the question Lance is talking about, some of the question of presidential and executive authority here. I know it seems unlikely that Congress would do this, but could Congress enact a federal mandate?
They could try, and they could use the Interstate Commerce Authority, which is the basic authority that Section 361 relies on to focus on the risk of interstate or interjurisdictional spread of disease as a nexus to then say essentially what they said in 361, that state and local actions are inadequate, and so that it's necessary for the federal government to step in and fill that gap. It would be more vulnerable to legal challenge than state and local mandates would. There's also the option of using Congress's spending power to essentially require state and local governments, or state governments first and foremost, to adopt mask requirements and enforce them. That would be problematic too, because it would be necessary to condition funding that is related to the pandemic in some way. And so you could actually end up in a situation not unlike the Medicaid expansion, where the states that need the support from the federal government the most may forego it for political reasons to kind of take a stand against what is seen as an overreaching federal government. I think the issue is moot with this Congress. We're just hoping for some basic financial support from this Congress. I think it's very unlikely that we get a national mandate for masks. And enforcement would be an issue as well. So I think it's really critical in this whole discussion about at which jurisdictional level should we fight for mandates, to remember that mask mandates are first and foremost a matter of persuasion. It's just not logistically feasible to enforce them everywhere. And the higher the level of government, the fewer tools there are available to enforce. And actually, some of the states that have declined to adopt statewide mandates have said that their reason for doing so is they don't have the enforcement mechanisms at the state level, that those enforcement mechanisms are local. And so they're encouraging local mandates. So yes, they could try. I think it would potentially further politicize the issue though.
So I'm gathering you're not so adamant on the necessity or the wisdom, I should say, of a federal mandate. Is there anything else you want to add about that?
I think that's a fair characterization, and I think I would say the wisdom of it. I think it. I often say a newly elected President Biden is not going to be the one to convince my uncle in Georgia to wear a mask. And the person who's most likely to convince those who are hesitant or recalcitrant are local leaders. And so, it takes time and patience, and that's something that a lot of us don't have with a situation that's as dire as it is. But I'm really encouraged by the steady expansion of local mandates and of statewide mandates with some local adjustment and enforcement and buy-in. I think that's by far the best approach, in part because of enforcement mechanisms, because and it varies from state to state, but the enforcement mechanism that I find most promising for mask mandates is actually business licensing. So instead of handing out fines to individuals the way that you would for something like an open container law, if you're walking around with alcohol, instead of doing that, you actually go and conduct business inspections. It's the kind of health department or the licensing, agency for food service or whatever else, not the police, which minimizes the risk of police escalation, of confrontations. And so I think that's a far better approach. And so with that in mind, I'm most interested in adopting mandates at the jurisdictional level in any given state that has that authority, that enforcement authority.
Thanks, that's really great. When you think about enforcement, I come from a state where we've had a mandate for quite a long time. The government just strengthened it. And yet, my neighborhood, a lot of people aren't wearing masks still all these months later. And I gather from the data that we are more in compliance than many states. So getting to real robust compliance is quite a challenge, even when you have a rather strict mandate on the books. Lance, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the wisdom of mandates at a national level.
Well, I largely agree with what Lindsay already said. I think that while there could be some potential advantages to a national level mandate, including the signaling that it sends about how important wearing masks is to stopping the spread of this disease, and trying to harmonize some level of rules for mask wearing nationwide, the potential backlash and the potential downside of that action might outweigh any kind of effectiveness. And I think the enforcement issue is a really serious one as well, in terms of how would a national mandate coming from the federal government be enforced. Certainly it wouldn't be able to be enforced from officials at the federal level, and we'd need to rely on those state and local officials anyway. In terms of other ways that the law could be, I mean, Lindsay mentioned in her earlier answer the idea of using the spending power, and I wonder if, and I'm not sure to what extent this is happening. I think probably not much yet, even at the state and local level, is to have state and local governments, or even the federal government, but distributing it at the state and local level, to provide access to a huge amount of PPE. So have those masks available at every business, maybe even require the businesses to carry the masks, to have them at the front door when people come in, and to make it sort of a ubiquitous norm that people are just expected to wear masks. I also think that, while President Biden is not going to convince Lindsay's uncle to wear a mask, an absence of a President Trump constantly undermining mask wearing, I think, will help. And I think it'll give some room for some of those state and local officials to not have to feel like they have to placate that position as much as they have been in the recent few months. And then the sort of sad perspective, unfortunate perspective on what's going on now is, because we're going into this huge spike right now, and we are finally seeing states like Iowa and others that were holdouts, not willing to try to introduce mask mandates, starting to kind of give in because they realize how serious the situation is. That might also spur more people to, I think, be willing to comply, because they're really going to see firsthand that this is something that it's not about, or it becomes less about their individual freedom and more about, oh, I don't want to kill my neighbors or expose them to this deadly disease.
Well, this is great. This is both a little bit sobering. Nothing like having some of the legal experts tell us about how the law alone is not a magical silver bullet here, but also hopeful. Any final thoughts, Lindsay, on what we can do to increase mask wearing, or are we condemned to have shutdowns rather than mask wearing?
Well, I guess two thoughts. I think I'm really encouraged by what we're hearing as a consistent, clear message from the members of the President-elect Biden's task force, who have been out spreading the word in the press. And I think what they've landed on in the Biden team is exactly the right approach. We need federal financial support to do the kind of thing that Lance is mentioning, to make better PPE, particularly available, widely available, convenient, right at the door of the store for those who have forgotten it. And that takes federal financial support and supply chain coordination. I also think, I'm really liking that I'm hearing from them that they are going to work behind the scenes quietly to encourage hesitant, read Republican governors and mayors to adopt their own mandates. The press immediately went to, the governor of South Dakota and said, are you going to agree to do a statewide mask mandate? And she said, no, but that's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be done quietly, not in a grandstanding kind of politicized way. And I also think the federal government hopefully can play the role it has always been intended to play through the CDC in developing best practices, putting out information to states about what is the right approach, because tightest restriction isn't always the best approach for compliance. Requiring masks to be worn outdoors in places where people can be distanced can actually, they can see that as arbitrary. They're understanding based on what they're being told that that's not a high risk. And so CDC leadership, not control, but guidelines to state and local governments about what are the approaches that are working best, I think would be critical. But I think it's important to end on a note where we say, listen, mask mandates are not a silver bullet here, and we know that, and we've known it from the start. They've been, to some extent, the idea that with masks we can avoid all other restrictions. That message has been put out in some cases in an effort to encourage people to wear masks, but I think it sets unrealistic expectations. We've seen places with strict mask requirements experience a resurgence. And so I think, it's a combination. I really think this Swiss cheese metaphor really helps to capture the idea that we need layered interventions. But a mask requirement can help us avoid the harshest restrictions. And I think that's really impactful and important.
And Lance, do you have final thoughts on this?
Well, I'll just add to what Lindsay just said. I think that the role that mask mandates or other mask encouragement can play is really important. And one optimistic thing I think that we can take out of this, even though compliance with mask wearing is not as high as we want it to be, and it's not as high as it's needed to be, we've seen a huge behavioral change across the. Changing cultural norms about what people wear and their behavior is something that usually takes quite a long time. And the fact that we've seen such a change in a short amount of time, I think is actually it's kind of remarkable. I think that's going to continue to expand. And if it's coupled with other necessary interventions, then we can actually see some positive results. I also think that, continuing to reiterate that point about that, masks are not a panacea. Masks are not going to solve all of our problems. We need all these other intervention strategies. Also needs to be extended not just to mask wearing, but also to everyone's hope for the vaccines that are coming down and being developed. I think people see those vaccines as the silver bullets that will get us out of this immediately, and that's not going to be the case. It's going to take a long time for there to be enough uptake of those vaccines and for us to really be able to transition back to a set of behaviors where we interact with people frequently without those protections safely. And so I think the message and the legal efforts to try to support people to get to where we need to eventually get to are going to take all of those combination of strategies together, and we need to continue to remind people of that so that they don't think that that there's an easy answer to this, because there isn't, unfortunately.
Well, good advice, and thank you to both of you, Lindsay and Lance, for a really thoughtful, sometimes sobering, but also optimistic conversation. And thank you to all of our listeners. We will be broadcasting here on Twitter every Tuesday and Thursday at noon Eastern Time. Just go to @PHLawWatch or search #COVIDLawBriefing. Recordings are available on the Public Health Law Watch website, and the shows are archived by the Week in Health Law podcast at www.twihl.com. The COVID Law and Policy briefings are produced by Faith Kallick, Summer Brown, and Liz Voiles. We'll see you next time. Please stay safe, wear your mask, and wash your hands.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.